She is still not translated into Hebrew because she thought, indeed, it was a mistake to ground a state on this basis, and that it would that to have religion as a basis of citizenship would produce, in her mind, in her view, an inevitable and infinite conflict for which there could be no resolution. Zertal points as well to the '67 war, in which the state built the case that nothing less than the destruction of the Jewish people was at stake, and common consensus was built around the thought that this was in fact true. In fact, Zertal, in her book Israel's Holocaust and the Politics of Nationhood, remarks that the use of the Holocaust in contemporary Israeli politics demeans and devalues the sufferings of those who survived the camps. She writes the following: according to circumstances of time and place, the Holocaust victims were brought to life again and again and became a central function in Israeli political deliberation, particularly in the context of Israeli-Arab conflict, and especially at moments of crisis and conflagration, namely in wartime. There has not been a war in Israel from 1948 to the present ongoing outburst of violence, which began in October 2000, that has not been perceived, defined, and conceptualized in terms of the Holocaust. This move, which, initially goal-restricted and relatively purposeful, aimed at constructing Israeli power and consciousness of power out of the total Jewish powerlessness, became in due course, as the Israeli situation was further removed in time and circumstances from the Holocaust, a rather devalued cliché. Auschwitz, as the embodiment of the total ultimate evil, was and still is summoned up for military and security issues and political dilemmas which Israel has refused to confront, resolve, and pay the price for, thus transmuting Israel into an ahistorical and apolitical twilight zone where Auschwitz is not a past event, but a threatening present and constant option. Zertal's book offers a nuanced and capacious effort to trace the way that the Holocaust is remembered and forgotten in the first decade of Israeli statehood, the Eichmann trial, and the expansion and justification of the Israeli armed forces. What is for me remarkable about this book, and even qualifies it as a political inheritor of Primo Levi's own complex writings on this issue, is the insistence, on the one hand, of the enormously traumatic effect of the Holocaust on the Jewish people, and the warning, on the other hand, against the exploitation of this suffering to authorize further unnecessary violence. Her effort is to reconstruct various episodes from Israeli state formation in order, and I quote, to examine the discrepancy between the historical dimensions of events and the national memory molded upon them, end quote. Zertal actually cites Levi at length, especially his claims about the difficulty that survivors faced in being able to give an account of their suffering. For Levi, those who would be true witnesses were rendered mute by the brutality of what they underwent. Those who survived to tell often lost the memories they needed for traumatic reasons, or could only reiterate stories without finally knowing the extent to which they had become unanchored from memory itself. According to Elie Wiesel, but also Jean-François Lyotard, one of the founding aims of the Israeli state was to provide a place and a framework for that telling. Zertal cites Lyotard in the following, unquote, the shades of those to whom had been refused not only life, but also the expression of the wrong done them by the final solution, continue to wander in their indeterminacy. By forming the State of Israel, the survivors transformed the wrongs into damages and the differend, the fact of competing and irreconcilable frames of reference, into litigation. By beginning to speak in the common idiom of public international law and of authorized politics, they put an end to the silence to which they had been condemned, end quote. Now, Levi remarks upon this same founding aim of the Israeli state, but with a caveat that is absent in the account provided by Lyotard. Levi writes, the state of Israel was supposed to change the history of the Jewish people, but in a very precise sense. It was supposed to be a life raft, the sanctuary to which Jews threatened in other countries would be able to run. That was the idea of the founding fathers, and it preceded the Nazi tragedy. The Nazi tragedy multiplied it 1,000-fold. Jews could no longer do without that country of salvation. Nobody stopped to think that there were Arabs in that country, end quote. In 1976, however, he tells an interviewer, and I quote, I must admit that after 1950, this image of the Jewish homeland gradually faded in me, end quote. Indeed, there were more than 700,000 Palestinians forcibly dispossessed of their lands and their homes through the establishment of Israel in 48, and the Israeli Defense Forces did have those Arab populations in mind when it seized those lands. And in 1950, the laws that justified the transfer of those properties to Israelis were put in place in defiance of UN resolutions for reparation and return. Now, in recent years, scholarship has emerged that asks how the situation of the refugees from the camps became linked with the founding of Israel. And in this context, it's doubtless important to remember that in 1946, Britain refused to receive any more refugees from the war and proposed to send the thousands of refugees aboard the ship called Exodus back to Germany for resettlement. The survivors aboard that ship wandered for over 2 years before landing in Israel. Paradoxically, Ben-Gurion, the president of Israel, asked that these survivors be permitted to land nowhere but in Palestine. Right? He actually got signed contracts from the US, from various European countries. Do not take them. In a recent book entitled In the Twilight of the Holocaust, Joseph Grodnitsky documents the struggles between Zionists and non-Zionists in the deportation camps. Because apparently the only way you could actually get out of the deportation camp, this is 45 to 48, was on the condition that you emigrate to Palestine. So some people were literally bribed, and there were overt fights about this. And I think we can see in these events the way in which Israel as a sanctuary for refugees was also used for political reasons to link survivors with the project of state formation, sometimes unwillingly. And of course there's a longer story in here as well about Martin Buber and Bert Magnus and efforts to, between 45 and 48, to establish a binational state, something which originally did have British and US support, but which was overcome politically by Ben-Gurion in 48 when Israel as a land of Jewish sovereignty was established. In any case, if the situation and discourse of the extermination camps becomes instrumentalized for political purposes, how do we then proceed to understand this discursive deployment as it once prompted by trauma, as a kind of reenactment of trauma, and as a reenactment of trauma in the context of instrumental state and military actions? To the extent that the Shoah continues to define the imperiled and victimized condition of the Jewish people today, and the Jewish people are identified with the state of Israel, then it follows that there is no history after the Holocaust that is not defined and haunted by the condition of victimization and the various licenses that attend to that protracted condition. Of course, the imperative never to forget applies to the Holocaust itself, and yet the stories of state formation do systematically forget the sometimes coerced conditions in which Jews were made to emigrate to Palestine and the systematic displacement of Palestinians without reparations from their homes and their land. It would doubtless be a mistake to say that the answer to this problem is simply forget the Holocaust, live in the present. That imperative can't work, only because of the profound way that history itself changed for the Jews after the concentration camps. The question, rather, is in what way history has changed. And it would seem to me that writers like Levi and Zertal both ask whether, for them, the Shoah and its suffering might contribute to an ethical and political framework for the present that speaks up against state-sanctioned violence that serves no aim but to control, intimidate, and demean a population that is for the most part living in conditions of unacceptable restriction and poverty. As we know, trauma takes on the character of repetition. It breaks into the present and reabsorbs the very possibility of the present into the past, maintaining those who are traumatized in an uncertain historical time in which the agents who inflict traumatic suffering repopulate one's world and foreclose upon the possibility of opening to a different future. There was a symptomatic moment in 1982 when Begin announced that he had, with his military forces, successfully encircled Berlin, when he meant to say Beirut. Can we read in that slip something like the work of trauma to reabsorb every present circumstance into the recurrent and ravenous pain of the past? Is Beirut still Israel's Berlin? What would it mean to awake to a present that would learn from the Holocaust the necessity of opposing fascism, racism, state violence, and forcible detention?